Billy, thank you very much. You know, I used not to know what a carbon footprint was. Wes, I thought it might be a big footprint. But carbon footprint is for real. And to help us understand that in a way that is as easy to understand as anybody I've ever seen put it is our next speaker, Dr. Sarah Place. Dr. Sarah Place, Oklahoma State University, studied at UC Davis. She is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Elanco. Before that, she worked for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Again, with this term concept of sustainability. And James Henderson, B3R Angus at Memphis, Texas, I love the way he put it with first winner of the Angus Sustainability Award. He said, what is sustainability? It's doing more with less. And as we look at a growing global population and reducing land to be able to produce food on, sustainability is very real. And Dr. Sarah Place, I believe, is going to share some fun things with us today to help make it more real for us today. Please welcome Dr. Sarah Place.
Thanks very much. There it goes. It's on now. Is it? Okay, perfect. Thanks very much for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Happy to be here. I've been through Canadian Texas a couple of times, and so it's good to actually spend some time here. So good morning to you all, and I will get right into this topic of sustainability, which can be a bit of a buzzword, and Andrew gave me this title, right? So is ranching really sustainable, and what's all the carbon talk about, which I think is a good way to put it, right? So let's get right to it. Sustainability, what does this topic actually mean? What are we actually talking about? When it comes to sustainability, there can be a lot of different definitions. Right? It's a word you can pour whatever you want into it, basically. But what there is broad agreement on is that basically sustainability is about three main areas. You got economics. First and foremost, you have to be economically viable. You're not going to be sustainable, right, as any business. There's the environment piece, and then also social issues, right? So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about basically the greatest hits of the environment piece, right? The facts versus reality of how some of these things get talked about. But what's on the slide here is just some of those key issues that we can think about fall under sustainability. And hopefully this makes sense why it seems like if you've ever had one of these conversations with somebody who's skeptical about beef, right, it always seems like there's always a what about question that comes after you explain something, right? And that's because it's such a long list of issues and concerns that people are hearing about, especially in the mainstream press, right? And what I've got on this slide here, those questions, right? What are people asking? They're asking, how should we be growing food? What should we be eating, right? Can beef or should it be a part of a sustainable diet? And the reason I put these questions up here is because anytime we use the word should, right, we've departed the land of objectivity, right? I'm going to talk to you about the science, but reality is it's all about value judgments, right? And it's about how people are thinking about these issues in terms of how it makes them feel in a lot of cases. So that's what can make it difficult, right, is because of those should questions that people are asking. So we're trying to balance all these things at once. There are trade-offs. There are lots of things that we are doing that are benefits, right, win-wins. You heard that earlier with the Cattle Facts presentation, the tremendous strides that have been made by the industry, and I'll kind of touch on that from a little bit more of an environmental angle as well. So I mentioned the greatest hits, right? One of the first thing that comes up, believe it or not, oftentimes when you read some of these news articles, is the idea of feed-food competition, right? Our livestock or our cattle basically stealing food from the mouths of babes, if you will, right? They're taking food that could be used for people and using it, right, themselves. So what is the facts versus fiction on that one? Sorry. Said hold it close to my mouth. I'm probably a little bit too loud. So the reality is that when we think about cattle production, what they're really doing is what we call upcycling, right? You've all heard of recycling, taking something, making something of equivalent value. Upcycling is taking something that's of little or no value and making a higher value product. That's what cattle do every single day, right? At the end of the day, what you guys are all doing and participating in is harvesting solar energy, right, and converting it to superior products through beef cattle, right? That is ultimately what the cattle industry is all about. And what's important there is this kind of little chart at the bottom, if you can't read that in the back, but what's that showing is the life cycle feed intake for grain-finished beef in the US. So almost 90% of what cattle eat, even when they're going to the feedlot and being finished on a grain-based diet, is actually not grain, right? It's human inedible feedstuffs, whether it's the grazed forage, harvested forages, and then all the byproduct feeds that we feed the cattle industry. So the reason that's so important, again, is because we're taking things that are of little or no value and making superior products, right? Harvesting plants that can't be used otherwise. So this is like the core fundamental value proposition for cattle, and it often gets left off, right? And I'll kind of emphasize this several times, but the trade-off of this is these animals make methane gas. But the fact that they do this is a rather worthy trade-off, right, in my perspective. So, expanding on this a little bit more, right, this whole upcycling idea, and this is why I said the value proposition of cattle. This is a way to put math to it. The other thing that's on this chart as we go through it will make sense is, as I just led with sustainability, it all depends on perspective and how you present things. And so this is a great example of presenting one thing, which is feed conversion efficiency, 3 different ways, and you get 3 different answers in terms of what system is quote-unquote best. So I'll walk you through this. So what we're looking at here is grain-finished beef from a life cycle perspective, dairy, this is some UK numbers, broiler chickens, and hogs, okay? And we're comparing in the first column that's in black, what are the pounds of feed dry matter that are required to make a pound of live weight gain, or in the case of dairy, a pound of fresh weight milk. So again, this is a life cycle number for beef, right? If that was a conversion in a feedlot, we'd have a lot of problems, right? But this is taking into account cow-calf and stocker. And so when a lot of folks look at this, especially when they compare the meat animal species, right? They say, well, if we're gonna eat meat, why do we eat beef? Look at how inefficient these animals are. It takes so much feed, right? And while that's true, because of course they're ruminant animals, they have a longer life cycle than a 6-week-old chicken, right? But the reality is just what I shared with you, right? Most of that feed is not in competition with human food. If we care about feed conversion efficiency from the societal perspective, because we're competing with human resources, we're not really competing, right? Hopefully that makes sense. And so that's what that middle column is. If we're gonna hone in on actually this idea of what's human edible versus not, okay? These are the pounds of human edible feed inputs that go into these animals to make a pound of live weight gain or a pound of fresh milk, okay? So what's super interesting is when we do that, look at it from that perspective, right? The differences between pigs and chickens and cattle really go away. And that's of course because those animals are eating mostly human edible feeds, right? Cattle are not. So we can take this one step further, okay? And this is, for me, I think the most important column, which is the far right-hand side, because it's the most relevant from a human nutrition perspective. So this is saying, what is the protein value of beef or pork or chicken or milk from a standpoint of what it delivers to us from a nutrition perspective? And what that means is, like, what are those little building blocks of protein, the amino acids? Are they in the right composition, or are they digestible? Because that's what we actually need every day. So what is that protein value of the animal product over the protein value of the feed inputs we put into these critters, right? So hopefully that makes sense. In this case, a higher number in this last column is actually better. If we're above 1 in this last column, that means the system itself actually generates more high-quality protein than it uses. And you'll note for both beef and dairy cattle, it's well above 1. What does that mean? That means the US beef industry generates more high-quality protein than it uses. From a sustainability standpoint, that's really important, right? We're truly making something from nothing, and that's because cattle are ruminants, right? They're eating these poor-quality foodstuffs. They have those microbes in their gut. They get a lot of their protein requirements met by those bugs rather than having to eat high-quality protein, and that means that we get this return that's above 1 from that standpoint. So this is not a knock against pigs or chickens, right? Probably everybody in this room would rather eat bacon than a corn-soy mixture, right? Realistically. I know I would. So they all have their role to play, right? But this standpoint, and thinking about it from a food security standpoint, this is why ruminants, cattle are so important, right? Is this ability to upcycle and upgrade protein. The other way to think about this, and this will be kind of a repeat theme of what I'll share with you all, is this whole idea that it's plant-based or it's animal-based, right? This either or in agriculture, which is really just silly, right? Because at the end of the day, as we know, plant and animal agriculture are totally connected. You can't really pull the two apart. And there's so many examples where animal agriculture actually helps make the rest of agriculture better, right? And more sustainable. So this is one way to look at it. We can go through the grocery store and we could pull a lot of things off the shelf to tell these type of stories. But one, you could say, well, what are three main breakfast beverages that we consume? Orange juice, so-called almond milk, right? I grew up on a dairy farm, so it pains me to say that. And then cow's milk, I put in tongue-in-cheek, right? The original plant-based milk. So what is the connection there in terms of those three products? Well, they're all made in California, right? And if we think about the raw ingredients and how we go from oranges to orange juice and almonds to almond hulls, what happens is we generate a lot of byproducts. And those byproducts are part of the reason why the California dairy industry is so large, right? Because all those byproducts were available as cheap feed historically. So those get mixed together, right, in a TMR. If you're talking to somebody that doesn't know anything about cattle, right, you say, hey, it's a cattle casserole. We mix it all together, right? We feed it to these critters, and they make a higher quality product in terms of milk, a more nutrient-dense product than other knockoff alternatives. So that's really what's key, right, is for every 100 pounds of human food that comes from crops globally, there's about 37 pounds of byproducts that get generated. Most of those end up in animals, right? Avoid going to a landfill. That's got a lot of benefits from that standpoint. And again, this just tells that story of why animal agriculture is so critical if we're going to have a sustainable food supply. The other thing about feed food competition, as I referenced earlier, right, you're going to get these what about questions, right? Usually when you present this type of information, people are like, well, that's great, but what about all the land, right? There's so much land that gets used for cattle production. And oftentimes what will happen is land footprint numbers will get quoted, right? And as Donald mentioned, right, the carbon footprint, water footprint, that just means how much per unit of production. So in the case of land footprint, how much land it takes to make a pound of beef. And let's be real, right, the land footprint of beef compared to another product is a lot bigger because of the type of land that gets used to produce beef, right? That's just a logical thing. Because of these three things that are on the slide, a land footprint doesn't really tell you a whole lot of information, right? First and foremost, every acre can't be used for everything. All the tremendous rangeland resources that we have in the United States, the only way we're going to produce human food or fiber from those landscapes really is with a ruminant. The other key thing is that land use is multifunctional. I think this is one of those other great stories, just like with the breakfast beverages, to tell people, we think about the image on the slide there in the Southern Great Plains grazing winter wheat, right? And being able to tell that story for folks of 1 acre is supporting wheat production for human food and growth of cattle, right? You get the bun and the burger from 1 acre. Pretty good deal, right? And the last thing is just minimizing land use isn't always the best thing, right? Of course, from a long-term sustainability perspective, if we're just intensively tilling land, right, if we're not implementing conservation practices, we can get degradation of that resource, right? So again, that's why a land footprint tells you something, but not that much. And another way to think about this is, overall, what I shared with you earlier about the actual amount of grain that gets used by cattle in the U.S. If you do the math on it, and given crop yields, it's roughly about 8% of corn that goes to finished cattle in the U.S., okay? Which is about 2% of U.S. cropland acres. So what does that look like? It's about the size of that box that popped up on the screen, right? So it's not nothing, but again, it's not an inordinate amount of land that I think sometimes is in folks' mind. And truly, that is the land that kind of is in competition with alternative uses, right, that we could use for something else. But as I shared with you, we take that land use, we run it through cattle, we're actually making 2 times more protein than would exist without cattle. So it seems, again, to be a fairly good trade-off. And the other colors on this map, if you can't read this legend at the bottom, but basically in the eastern U.S., this brown color is all our forest lands. The green is our cropland, Mississippi River Valley out in Central Valley, California. And then all those yellow colors are pasture and rangeland. Right? And again, that's the bulk of the resources that are used for beef production in the U.S. These type of very basic facts and realities, I'm not telling anything you guys don't know, right? But when you have these conversations with folks outside of agriculture, these are things that actually really surprise folks, And the other way to think about this, as I kind of transition talking about climate change, I know you all have dealt with a lot of fires recently, but one way to think about this is even in the state of California, right? So what are we looking at here? What I've done is basically put two things on this chart. So we have carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, that's greenhouse gas emissions. And in the kind of tan color, we're looking at enteric fermentation. It's kind of like a fancy way to say the cow burps, right? The methane that comes from cattle. In the blue are emissions that come from wildfires in the state of California. Okay, so you'll see there are certain years where wildfire emissions exceed, right, the emissions from enteric fermentation. And as I've called out, because the data weren't available to put it on the slide here, but 2020 emissions were over 110 million metric tons. It's hard to know, like, what does that even mean, right? That's actually more emissions than the entire US dairy industry produces, okay? So it's a big number. So why do I put this up here? Again, I think that's that key thing of thinking about trade-offs, right? Cattle can't prevent all wildfires, but they can help reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires, right? So a very simple way to think about it is, why not run the carbon through a ruminant and slowly burn it in metabolism rather than lighting it on fire, right, with a fire, right? So that is one of those key things in thinking about the trade-off there and telling that story for beef production. So I just introduced this idea of greenhouse gas emissions, right? Sustainability is complex, but as you guys all see, at the end of the day, a lot of these conversations come down to climate change, right? And thinking about how cattle contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So a little bit of context here, facts versus fiction in terms of what's actually happening. So to start off, this is the very big picture globally. What are some of the trends in greenhouse gas emissions? So on the y-axis or the vertical axis, we got greenhouse gas emissions, the total mass. And then these different colors are referring to different categories of emissions, okay, from 1990 to today. The biggest one at the bottom is energy emissions, right? So this is burning fossil fuels for all the things that we do as human beings, like the fact that I could travel here from 2,500 miles away, right, in a few hours, right? That's part of that piece. And you'll note the headline at the top, right? So emissions are actually up. Ag and land use is actually down globally, or pretty much flat, even though we've increased the population. So we're talking about US, we're gonna talk about cattle. Woo. But, right, this is actually key because, right, we have to feed more people, and this is a great example of global agriculture really doing an excellent job from that standpoint. So what about the US? This is the data from the US EPA, okay? So now we're looking at the y-axis. This is percent of greenhouse gas emissions that come from each one of these categories, right? And this is where the emissions are actually coming from. So transportation, electricity, all other industrial uses, residential uses. So I live in upstate New York. It gets really cold. I have an oil furnace, right? That's what's in that category there of other uses, right? Landfills and waste are about 2% of emissions. And then agriculture, as I've kind of broken out, right? These are the emissions that are directly coming from agriculture. One key thing, right? It says agriculture is 10% of emissions. What I don't have on here is forestry and land use, right? If we add those emissions in, that's actually about an 11% sink, right? Meaning it draws down about 11% of US emissions. So if we add agriculture plus forestry together in the US, it is a net sink, right? So think about that from our food and fiber perspective, total production, it is a net sink. If we think about just beef cattle, the methane they naturally produce and the emissions from their manure, it's about 2% of emissions, okay? So there's a lot of headlines, a lot of discussion for 2%, right? It's not nothing, we can do things to reduce it, but it's not the biggest chunk. And you'll note it's the same as landfills and waste. And the reason I always put this up here, and this is also to make you feel guilty right before you go to lunch, is the number one source of material that goes to landfills that actually makes methane gas is food waste. So again, from a whole system perspective, we think about sustainability. That's one of our key opportunities because in the US, we waste 30 to 40% of edible food, right? So we put all this effort into producing food. We have this great, safe food supply, and then we end up wasting a whole bunch of it, right? So it's kind of a double whammy there from a standpoint of using all those resources and then actually not nourishing anyone at the end of it. So you'll note that livestock about 4%, kind of keep that number in mind because I'll come back to that at the end, but crop production actually directly emits more emissions than livestock directly do in agriculture in the US. The other thing is these issues of greenhouse gas emissions and everything else, we often use global percentages and they get applied to the United States. But that's not very appropriate, and a big reason why is because things are very variable around the world in terms of how efficient they are. As was mentioned at the top, right, doing more with less is a key part of sustainability. And doing more with less means that we actually have fewer greenhouse gas emissions per pound of beef that get produced. So what's on this chart here is just showing that visually. Okay, so this is some information from a publication, The Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences. If you can't see the scale, just know that the dark green colors on the map are where we have lower carbon footprints. It's kind of lighter green colors are where we have intermediate carbon footprints. The places that are purple on this map have carbon footprints that can be 50 to even 100 times greater than the United States for beef. It's huge variation, right? Why? Why is there such huge variation? Honestly, it comes down to the very basics of animal husbandry and management, okay? It really comes down to how many animals are in a nation's herd to produce a certain amount of beef production. So again, think about what Troy told you from the cattle facts presentation, right? We produce more beef with the same amount of cattle. And that has a quote-unquote carbon benefit as well, because we don't take as many resources to produce the same amount of human nutrition. So an example here, right, US, we are the #1 beef producer in the world. We produce around 27 billion pounds of beef. We had a cattle herd size in January of this year, somewhere around 93, 94 million if you add all the beef and dairy cattle together. The #2 beef producer in the world is Brazil. They produce around 21 billion pounds of beef, okay? So about 6 billion pounds fewer than the United States. But their cattle herd size is about 220 million head, okay? So they have twice as many cattle as the United States, and they produce less beef. So that's why they have a higher carbon footprint. Hopefully that makes sense intuitively. Things like the genetic potential of animals, good quality nutrition, reproductive efficiency, all those things that you do to make your business better, quite frankly, make the carbon footprint lower as well, right? So that's one of those key opportunities from a win-win opportunity standpoint. So I mentioned this a couple times, right? The so-called gassy cow issue. #1, I always say if you take one thing away from this presentation, know it's cow burps, not cow farts, right? Just make sure you always correct people, right? And this whole process of making methane, it's a natural part of the process, right? We have a picture of an animal, a bovine on here. It could be a buffalo, could be a giraffe. They're also ruminants, right? They all do this, right? They have this unique relationship with these microbes in their gut. They consume feed. Those microbes break it down. Some microbes actually make methane. Every minute they got to remove it, right? If they don't remove the gas, they get bloat, right? So this is a natural part of the whole digestion process. Most of it comes out the front end of the animal, and this key thing on the bottom, this is something that folks often don't know or understand as well, which is actually when we feed more forage, more fiber in the diet, we're eating a grass-based diet, the animals make more methane per unit of dry matter intake. Then when they go to, say, a feed yard, they're eating a grain-based diet, steam flake corn, all the rest, they actually make a lot less methane. That's part of why they're more feed efficient when they go to a feed yard. Okay, so methane itself, even if you don't care about the climate change aspects of it, just know that methane is basically a loss of feed calories. It's feed you put into the animal, it's getting blown off to the atmosphere that you didn't capture in the animal as a saleable product. So again, that's part of why when we feed animals grain, we improve that efficiency, we reduce the amount of methane that we emit from animals. So that's a big picture, right? Methane is a greenhouse gas, and that's, to be clear, it is. It's also a part of a cycle, though, right? So if, again, we think about what these animals are doing and think about how they're capturing solar energy, right? The very basics of what's happening out on the landscape. Photosynthesis, carbon dioxide from the air, water, sunlight. It's an incredible miracle, right? We actually capture carbon out of the air into plants. What happens when those animals consume it? Well, they're going to retain a lot of the carbon, right? That's what beef is. It's a solar energy product. You can market that as what it is, carbon capture product. They're going to produce milk, right? They're going to have all these other products. They're obviously also going to return some of that carbon to the soil, right? Manure, urine, that's going to cycle back around through the animal. And some of that carbon is going to get emitted into the atmosphere naturally, right, as it gets broken down. And so isn't the carbon in the animal itself when it respires, right? Just as we are doing right now, we're taking in solar energy derived carbon, we eat it. Most of it actually ends up going out as CO2. I ended up eating like 3 cookies last night, so I'm probably retaining more carbon than I should, right? But usually you're going to hopefully be respiring most of it. And some of that carbon is also in methane. So that's what CH4 is, methane. Roughly 1 to 3% of the carbon an animal eats every day is going to get emitted as methane. Again, that's just a natural part of the process. What's unique about methane is when it goes to the atmosphere, it doesn't stick around very long, right? So again, it's a greenhouse gas, it is potent, but after about 10 or 12 years, most of the methane that any given animal emits on a given day is going to get broken back down to CO2. So as you look at this graphic, right, hopefully that makes sense. Basically, all cattle are doing, any ruminant, you could swap out a mule deer, right, for this animal. They're just temporarily transforming some of the carbon to a higher potency gas that then gets broken down. And it's a fairly fast cycle, okay? So the reason I mentioned this cycling part, because that's actually really important in terms of how we account for the warming impacts of cattle production, right? And again, I know I'm standing between you and a former Secretary of State and dinner, right? But I'll try to explain some atmospheric chemistry in a short amount of time, okay? So why is this important? As I just mentioned, in terms of cattle emissions, most of the greenhouse gas emissions coming from cattle production are methane. So how we account for the short-lived nature of methane is very, very important, okay? And in how we think about the trends of emissions in the U.S. cattle industry. So one way to try to show this graphically, okay, accounting for the different warming impacts. There's a few different things happening on this slide. This is some information from UC Davis of trying to compare CO2, which is carbon dioxide, and methane, and how we account for them differently. And so-called differences between stock gases, like CO2, that keep accumulating in the atmosphere, versus flow gases like methane. So what we're looking at is on the vertical axis of both these little graphics is the atmospheric concentration, meaning how much, if we went outside today and took a sample in the air, how much is actually there, okay? That's the atmospheric concentration. That's actually what matters with climate change. We talk about emissions all the time, but it actually matters just how much is really there in the atmosphere is what matters, okay? So if we have this example and we have CO2, and in a given year in this dark blue box, we say, okay, we emit this amount of CO2, and you know what? We're gonna keep doing it every year for the next 5 years. What's gonna happen to the atmospheric concentration? Basically, every single year we emit CO2, it's going to build up into the atmosphere because it stays there for a while. It's a long-lived gas. And this is just what we would say, it's a conservation of mass, right? It's fairly straightforward in terms of what's going to happen there. If we have a situation with methane, again, our hypothetical example, we say same thing. We're going to emit just the same amount of methane every single year going forward, these 5 years. What's going to happen with the atmospheric concentration, assuming, right, that we're not doing anything to the atmospheric sink to destroy the methane? It's roughly going to stay the same, okay? So this is very important from an accounting perspective. If you have a steady state of methane emissions, you would not expect to see an increase in atmospheric concentrations of methane. Again, that's what's key to actual warming, which is actually what we care about when we talk about climate change. So again, a very important caveat here, this is if emissions and sinks are in balance, right? Globally, we know we have had an increase in methane emissions, but what about the U.S. cattle industry, right? Is U.S. cattle production significantly driving the atmospheric concentration of methane up? And reality is probably not, especially for beef cattle, right, recently. So you all know what's happened with cattle numbers in the U.S., right? Our cattle have gotten larger, they got more productive, they eat more, so they do emit more methane per animal, but still, we have not significantly increased the total amount of methane coming from beef cattle in the U.S. And so I know these graphics are a little bit small, but this is from a white paper that Dr. Frank Mittler and I produced out of UC Davis of just looking at direct emissions. And so that's what's over here on the left-hand side. This is just data from the EPA. This big blue chunk is the methane emissions that get produced. And then this right-hand side is using a new metric that actually takes into account the short-lived nature of methane. And you'll note that that graphic, it starts positive, goes negative, and goes positive again. And what's really being reflected there is what drought we went through 10 years ago and the destocking of the U.S. cattle herd, right, and actually the reduction of methane that happened. What that means when the graphic goes negative is we're actually having basically a cooling effect from the direct emissions reduction of methane, okay? And that's what's called out in that blue box here. If we look at the EPA data versus actually taking into account the warming of methane from a scientific perspective, we've basically, over the last decade, overestimated the amount of warming contribution coming directly from beef cattle in the US by about 90%, okay? So, I don't tell you all this to say, well, don't worry about methane, don't care about it, right? Rather, this is a huge opportunity for the cattle industry to show, from a positive perspective, rather than being defensive, how we are part of the climate solution. Hopefully that makes sense. Anything that we can do from a scientific perspective in economically relevant ways to reduce methane emissions has a huge benefit, right? And being able to talk about that and hopefully monetize that is very, very important, right? So related to that, related to the idea of monetization and this whole idea of what about all these carbon markets and everything else that's happening, okay? So I know this is kind of small font, but I'll just give you the highlights, right? Basically, if I was to sum up what we talk about the carbon markets today, it's very early days. And most of the carbon markets are voluntary, right? Meaning companies set goals. They say, for example, Delta Airlines, as I was flying out here, they have a little pamphlet and they say, we're going to be carbon neutral, right? Personally, don't want to fly on a carbon neutral plane anytime soon, right? But how are they saying that, right? What they do is they buy what are called carbon offsets, right? So what's key there is when we think about carbon offsets, what does that even mean, right? Basically, the unit of sale from a standpoint of, if you think about it, like what is the commodity we're buying and selling? It's a metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalents captured. That's what it is. So it's either stored in the soil, or like we were just talking about with methane from cattle, it would be like something you fed cattle and then reduced their emissions, right? So either side of the coin. And as I've called out here, this is the part that's a little tricky with some of these contracts. If you're going to generate a carbon offset, especially from soil, you got two key things that you got to think about. One is permanence, which is meaning how long is that carbon going to stay in the soil, right? And this is the tricky thing about some of these soil carbon contracts is theoretically people want to lock it up for like 100 years, right? But to sign something that says I'm not going to do anything to my land for 100 years is a bit much, right? So that's just one of those practical realities. Some of the contracts are shorter. It just really depends, and it's being evolved right now. As I've called out here, though, what's interesting is as we get more feed additives and other ways to actually reduce methane in animals, this is almost a little bit cleaner, right? Because you can say, well, I fed that today, I reduced methane, right? You don't have to worry about this whole long-term contract aspect. And additionality, that doesn't sound like a real word, but it is in the carbon markets. It's basically saying you got to do something additional compared to baseline. This is the other part that's tricky with these carbon markets. If you're a farmer and you've been doing really good and have great conservation practices for many years, you may have not that much ability to increase your soil carbon storage because you've already done a very good job. In that case, you really can't market carbon offsets in this traditional way, right? So this is one of those kind of insidious things about the carbon market is if you're a poor performer, you can take advantage more, right? So as I highlighted, right, the key thing is if you are getting into that space, just know what the contract says, right? Really is key about the length and what you're locking yourself into in any of these contracts. Can be really good, but it's just one of those things of definitely reading the fine print. So soil carbon itself, really hard to measure, and it's hard to increase when you're in a place where you get less than 20 inches of rain a year. That's just a reality, right? At the end of the day, what drives the whole carbon cycle in the soil is the microbes, right? And they need moisture and they need nitrogen to function. And so that's super key. And again, this opportunity here from an enteric perspective is probably cleaner, but we need the technologies actually being available. So this last thing here, just on the pricing though, and I'll kind of give an example here on the next slide. The reality is that the carbon prices are very low, right now, voluntary carbon prices in general. So on a per acre basis, it's not a huge incentive from that standpoint. So one example here, hypothetical, on the left-hand side, what if we actually have a feed additive we're feeding 250 cows to, versus on the right-hand side, we got like 3,700 acres. We're trying to get some sort of practice implemented where we're going to sequester 0.2 tons of carbon per year. And just what the economics look like at $3, not too attractive, right? $15, which is the current California offset market, a little bit better, right? I would say hopefully where we're headed is more of the high carbon price. This is really where the carbon price is in, say, Europe, okay, currently. And it's just a huge question mark of where it's going to go in the US. But the key thing here is just as prices get more favorable, the whole thing looks a lot better. When prices are so low, you know, is it worth it for you to lock something up? I don't really know, right? You would have to make that determination yourself, but looking at the numbers, right, hopefully you can think through that of how much revenue you're going to be really generating on your operation with some of these low carbon prices. Ultimately, I think these prices will go higher. It's just a question of when and how fast, and given all the current events that we're experiencing, right, I think the trajectory we're on is now a little bit more shaky in terms of where these are headed. So this last thing I'll finish with, of back to the greatest hits of sustainability, right, is this whole idea of dietary change. And you heard a little about that earlier, right? The idea, we're just going to eat our way out of climate change, right? We're all going to change our diet, and that's going to make such a huge, big difference. But this is really something that comes up again and again and again, right? And I've pulled this screenshot here of just from The Economist last year. They really pushed this article out a lot. And obviously this is an influential publication for financial folks, right? And we see so much of this pressure now on sustainability is actually coming from finance, not necessarily consumers. So just know that, right? There's potential access to capital challenges in the future because of these perception issues. But again, the idea of treating beef like coal, which I don't even know where you begin with that, right? But what is the reality of some of these things? So I'll start with this. If we think about the alternative protein movement, right, if you will, which I think is currently struggling if we look at the actual financials of some of these companies, but especially Impossible and Beyond Meat, how are they marketing their products? Are they marketing them as better tasting than beef? No, right? They're trying to say after you put a whole bunch of mayo and a bunch of other stuff on this burger, it kind of tastes like, well, you don't really taste it, so it's pretty good, right? But what they're really marketing it as is a sustainability play, right? That's how these products are being marketed. That's how they're getting investor funds, and that's how they're positioning it, especially to younger people in the country who want to feel like they're doing something good for the planet. And hey, if I can just make a little tweak to my diet and I feel like I checked that box, I'm going to do it, right? That's really how they're marketing it. So that's what's up in the upper right-hand corner. These are marketing materials from Beyond Meat. They say they're improving human health because, right, red meat's going to kill you. I didn't go through that, but that's been fairly debunked as well. Positively impacting climate change, and they have a chemical formula of CO2 superscript, which is not a chemical formula, but it's kind of emblematic of their marketing materials, right? They say we're addressing global resource constraints, so all that stuff I told you about feed food competition, they're going right at the heart of that issue. And then they say they're improving animal welfare because their products aren't made of animals, so they improved animal welfare, right? So again, this is just to highlight, this is how this stuff is being marketed. This is how they're gathering, right, investor funds, is 100% on sustainability. We've all seen images like this, right? This was shared with me from a friend in Michigan. April 2020, everybody ran on the grocery stores, and the poor souls that were late, right, ended up buying Beyond Meat, and Beyond Meat sales went up, right, during the pandemic, and they're like, wow, man, we're doing really great, but it's because it was like desperation buying, right, and that's what's happened. So what's the real bottom line if we're going to think about dietary change? This study here, I think, kind of sums it all up. A lot of the folks that are advocates for dietary change hate this study, but it really does kind of put everything in perspective in terms of what are the impacts if we were to change our diets in the U.S., okay? So these two scientists, they published this in the Proceeding in the National Academies of Sciences, and they said, okay, hypothetical example, it's unrealistic, but it puts an upper cap on what's possible. What if every American became a vegan? Right? And not just every human American, but every cat and dog, right? We're all miserable together. We're all vegans. What would happen? So they found that we would actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2.6 percentage points, okay? So think way back in the beginning of this presentation, I told you livestock emit 4% of emissions. but we only reduce emissions by 2.6 percentage points. So why is that? Okay, so that's what this bar chart is over on the right-hand side. This is looking at plus animals is as agriculture is today in the US and the different categories of emissions. That blue chunk is animal ag. And then minus animals is this vegan future, okay? So there's some changes there. One, what happens if you get rid of animals? You get rid of animal manure, right? So instead of cycling nitrogen back around in the livestock system or from agriculture, right? Now we had to use more synthetic fertilizer. The other thing that's on here that's increased is legumes, right? Because we're all eating a lot of beans to meet our protein requirements in a vegan future, right? And we need the nitrogen credits in the soil. So that's why it's 2.6 percentage points, okay? And the reality is in this scenario, you would produce more calories and more pounds of food. How many think America needs more calories? Not so much, right? But what's key is we actually wouldn't have enough essential micronutrients, especially things like vitamin B12, if we got rid of all the animals in our food supply. Okay, so vitamin B12 only comes from animal source foods. It's also needed for human cognition, right, development, nerve function, rather important molecule, right? So in this scenario, we'd have slightly fewer greenhouse gas emissions, right, and we'd all be mentally incapacitated. So it's a tough trade-off. And the last thing I'll say on this is just when we think about this scenario, as I said, this is the upper bound, the theoretically highest amount, because, as I put in this asterisk, this means all livestock go away, okay? They have to go away to get the emissions reductions. That means also, before we become vegans, we have one massive barbecue, right, before we say that's it. And we can't obviously replace all the cattle with bison or other ruminants, other ungulates that would be needed to maintain our grasslands, right? Because guess what? That's going to eat into the greenhouse gas emission benefit. We're going to produce methane from them too. So all this to say, right, the reality is we're not going to eat our way out of climate change, right? What we have to do is just keep making agriculture better as we have, right? That's the key way that we're going to keep making progress in this area. Again, some folks that advocate for dietary change, they don't like this study, but it is what it is. So I'll leave you with a little bit of food for thought here at the end, right? A little bit tongue-in-cheek. All this discussion of plant-based meats, right? And we can think about this as like, one, the beef industry already has an amazing technology that makes meat from plants, okay? It's pretty neat. So it's a technology, it actually runs on solar energy, incredible. Doesn't have to burn fossil fuels, but it's mobile. That's cool. And while it's harvesting all this solar energy, it produces a high-quality organic fertilizer that actually feeds the soil. That's pretty neat, right? And it self-replicates. This is incredible technology, right? I think we could get a lot of folks in Silicon Valley like very excited about this, right? It's called cattle, right? Of course, right? Plant-based meat is meat, right? Or beef at the end of the day. That's why we domesticated these animals in the first place thousands of years ago. So I think it's just one of those key things. Just remind people of the basics, right? This is why we do what we do. These animals make more nutrient-dense food for us. They have all these other co-benefits. It's incredibly important. And just have that positive spin of the industry's already done a lot, and we're going to continue to do more to innovate in this space, right? So bottom line, is ranching sustainable or livestock sustainable? Yes, right? It's just about getting better over time. That's all sustainability is about. It's on that track record that we have been on. What's super key is livestock produce nutrient-rich food. Again, I didn't really emphasize that nutritional piece, but I think that's absolutely essential. We are omnivores for a reason, right? And that's really key in that perspective. But they provide more than food. So whether it's wildlife habitat, again, prevention of catastrophic wildfires, all these other aspects that come from cattle production are very important as well. That key stat to keep in mind, right? Beef cattle, they're about 2% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Not nothing, we can work on it. But again, also knowing and understanding that methane piece, it's probably overestimated in terms of warming impact, and we can do a lot more to really show how cattle are part of the climate solution. And the last thing on carbon markets, again, just coming back to that, it's probably going to be a big potential in the future. Right now, it's pretty early days, right? I would describe it as it's the wild, wild west, and there's no sheriff in town when it comes to climate and carbon markets, right? So as things develop, I think that will become more of a real opportunity as we go forward. So sustainability, what is it? It's producing safe, nutritious food, doing it with environmental stewardship, social responsibility, and first and foremost, economic viability, right? That's what sustainability is. So with that, thank you very much. Happy to take any questions if you have them, but I really appreciate your attention.